They parked by the blue curb and left the engine running like a promise they never meant to keep. He didn't plead. He pressed his thumb against the brass compass and watched the needle steady, a small rebellion against the drift inside him. The doors of Seabright breathed him in. Disinfectant, salt air, and the hush of other people's endings. Mara spoke quickly, businesslike, collecting forms as if she were tidying grief into neat folders. Declan joked too loudly and checked his phone, as if noise could muffle the truth. In the lobby mirror, he looked smaller, but his eyes were bright, like lamps set low for fog. He knew what they didn't. Goodbyes are rarely final when they're told the right way. He smiled at the nurse who noticed, and somewhere far off, a lighthouse turned its beam. Morning brought the soft clatter of trays and the sharp scent of coffee, a kind of ordinary orchestra that made the night feel survivable. Jorge told him the trick to sleeping here was pretending the radiator was applause. Amara set a cup by his elbow and asked if he took sugar, and he said he'd learn to take things as they came. Somewhere, a radio hummed an old standard, and he remembered the way his wife used to hum along while tightening the buttons on his coat. The ocean outside was a flat coin, bright and distant. He told himself he would not measure love by proximity anymore. In this place, hands remembered how to hold, and voices remembered how to listen. He kept the compass tucked beneath the cup, a private north. He had a letter to finish and a promise to keep. Ruth walked him through the rules as if reading tides. Visiting hours were posted like a promise written in chalk, easily washed away. He nodded, not to agree, but to spare her the part where rules rarely fit the heart. Papers were signed. A wristband printed his name in block letters, a billboard for anyone looking for who he used to be. When they came to personal items, he listed the compass and the ring. Ruth paused at the ring, recognizing a story she had no time to ask about. He thought of the lighthouse again. The way its light didn't judge the boats it saved. In the courtyard, wind rattled the bare branches, and he imagined them leafed with later days. He had work to do before the tide turned. The phone call with Mara was short. She asked if he'd settled, as if comfort were a chair you could adjust by remote. He told her the nurses were kind and the view had a horizon. She promised to come by Sunday. He said Sunday would be fine. When the line clicked dead, he didn't feel smaller. He felt precise, like a note held to the right length. He opened his journal, dated the page, and wrote 3 names, then underlined them as if drawing a map. Mara, Declan, Amara. Some doors, he knew, only opened from the inside. He added a final word beneath the names, a word he trusted more than inheritance. He closed the book softly, not to wake the old ghosts. By evening, the building wrapped itself in its usual hush, the kind that remembers every footstep. Amara lingered at the doorway and told him the lighthouse would be visible after 9, if the fog lifted. He thanked her with a smile that felt almost like habit. Jorge tuned the radio to a station that crackled with brass, and for a moment the room felt like it was waiting for a dance. He placed the ring back on his finger and slipped the compass into his pocket, feeling the weight settle like a decision. Outside, the rain thinned to a soft stitch. Some goodbyes end a chapter. Others begin a test. He closed his eyes and pictured an empty law office filling with the right people at the right time. Light swept the clouds. He was ready. Kindness, he learned, isn't a grand speech. It's a steady tide. By midweek, the staff began finding small envelopes tucked where only weary hands would look. A crisp bill in the supply closet labeled 4 extra gloves. A bakery voucher slipped beneath the break room kettle. A handwritten thank you folded into a pocket at the end of a hard shift. He never signed his name. He circled the halls with unhurried steps, asking Jorge about melodies that made the rain listen, asking the quiet man near the window how the sea looked from his side. He carried no airs, only attention, and attention paid dividends fast. Laughter lingered longer after lunch. The TV's volume lowered because people were listening to each other again. When Amara teased that he walked like he owned the place, he smiled and said, Ownership had less to do with papers and more to do with what you choose to repair. He tapped his journal, underlined a date, and the compass hummed in his pocket. On bingo night, he asked for the microphone and replaced letters with lighthouses. "Nin stands for north," he said, and the room answered with the delight of children. Amara laughed until her cheeks shone, then handed him the next card and told him to call the numbers like coordinates home. He did, and residents who hadn't won anything in months won applause. He offered his chair to a woman whose hands trembled, pressed the card flat for her, and whispered the way keepers used to listen to fog. Patient, certain, undramatic. He watched Declan's name blink on his phone and let it pass like a distant ship he wasn't yet ready to hail. Instead, he bought an extra round of ginger cookies, told the kitchen he'd settle it later, and meant. The room tasted sweet and ordinary. He tucked his journal away and let the evening be exactly what it was. Proof that attention could be mapped, like light. After lights out, the place grew honest. He opened the journal, copied a string of numbers into a letter, and sealed it with the care of a gardener covering new roots. The envelope bore the attorney's name, and below it, a note for Amara. "When you're ready." Ready for what? He didn't define. He straightened his roommate's blanket, turned the dial on the radio to a station where horns drifted like tide, and counted backward through the years to the first time a bank manager underestimated him. He smiled at the memory, not unkindly. Money, he thought, is a kind of weather. It can ruin the crops or make them sing, depending on where you send the rain. He tucked the envelope into a book about lighthouses and placed it on the night table. The compass warmed against his palm. He breathed like a keeper on the last round, steadying the lamp before dawn. By noon the next day, new pillows arrived in bulk, the good kind that don't flatten by dusk. Ruth checked the invoice twice and found only a modest balance due with a note that read, "For better necks, signed, nobody." She confronted the hallway with her hands on her hips and found him beside the bulletin board, helping a resident pin up a painting of winter roses. She thanked him in a way that wasn't a question, and he answered in a way that wasn't a lie. He said some aches should be considered part of the package. Her sternness softened, but duty held. She asked him directly if he was the donor. He looked at the painting, not her, and said the sea teaches you to fix what leaks before you lecture the boat. She nodded, half annoyed, half amused, and made a note to call purchasing. The piano in the sunroom hadn't been tuned since before the world forgot how to visit. He found the card of a tuner in his wallet, someone who once owed him a favor, and called it in. By twilight, keys that used to wobble sang like they remembered their shapes. Jorge pressed his fingers down and grinned, the way a man grins when a locked door opens. Amara leaned on the doorway, shoulders lowered, as if a weight she'd never named had slipped. He watched them inhabit the room and felt the old ache in his chest loosen into something useful. If this place could hold a true note, it could hold more. He wrote another line in the journal. A gift that requests a task. He didn't say what the task was. He suspected they'd feel it before they heard it. Outside, the lighthouse swept past again. A metronome counting them in. The fog thinned into a pale ribbon, and with it, the morning felt like a clean margin. Amara wheeled the vitals. Cart through the corridor and found him already awake. Journal balanced on his knees as if it were a tide chart he alone could read. He spoke about sleep the way sailors speak about weather, briefly with respect. When she fluffed his pillow, he thanked her by name, and the way he said it made the room hold its breath. After rounds, she returned to find the journal closed, and the compass sitting on top like a paperweight for things heavier than paper. He'd left for physical therapy, leaving behind a page marker fashioned from a bus transfer stub. She smiled at the thrift of it, at the thought that nothing in his world was wasted. Curiosity wasn't prying, she told herself. Sometimes it was the work of care, making sure a story that mattered found its way to light. The page marker hid a cartographer's secret. Between neat lines of dates, he'd sketched lighthouse symbols in the margins, each marked with a tiny arrow, each arrow pointing not seaward, but inward. Numbers ran beside them, Not coordinates exactly, but something like them. Groupings that looked like account endings or safe deposit references, disguised as tides. In the left corner, a sentence in tidy block letters. Light only matters if someone keeps it. She traced the groove of his pen and thought of the way he walked the hall after lights out, slow and sure, testing the floor, as if listening for hollow places. The room gave up its hush to the hallway bustle, and she closed the journal with care. The question wasn't whether he was hiding something. It was whether he wanted it found by the right hands. On her break, she wrote the attorney's name on a sticky note and tucked it in her pocket. The therapy room smelled of rubber mats and determination. Elias moved through the motions with a patience that made the aides slow down to match him. When Amara arrived, he was gripping the rail and staring through the glass at the lighthouse photograph in the hall, as if measuring distance. She asked about the sketches in his book, careful to keep her tone like an open door rather than a test. He smiled and said some maps are made of promises, and some promises are kept by more than one person. He didn't tell her more, but his eyes did, softening at the edges, the way eyes do when they trust where a sentence will land. She told him the piano sounded different. He nodded, pleased, and said true notes. Make people braver than they expect. When he rested, he placed the compass in her hand and asked her to keep it until dinner. It was both a gift and a key. At shift, change the building tilts, the day exhaling as night inhales. Amara returned the compass to his nightstand and noticed the lighthouse book slightly askew. Between the last chapter and the back cover lay a sealed envelope, weighty for its size, the attorney's name written in the same firm hand as the journal. Beneath it, a second note, smaller, addressed to her. When you're ready, open this where the light can find us. She stood by the window, holding both, and felt the odd steadiness of being chosen. Ruth's footsteps clipped down the hall, and for a moment, Amara considered turning everything over, letting protocols make the decision. But the word ready grew louder than the rules. She slipped the smaller note into her pocket and carried the larger envelope to the desk, asking Ruth to witness receipt. Rules could be honored and still leave room for a human heart. Evening gathered like a choir finding pitch. Victor Hale arrived with a rain-dark coat and the air of a man who had learned to keep fragile things intact. He thanked Ruth, nodded to Amara, and requested a quiet corner. The envelope opened with the sound of a small door. Inside lay a letter and a single metal key, old-fashioned, teeth filed with precision. The letter spoke plainly. Instructions for a gathering, a date set soon, and a line that made Victor clear his throat. Those who left me will learn how to stay. Amara felt the words like a current underfoot. The key, Victor said, fit a cabinet in his office, and in that cabinet lay the rest of the map. He folded the letter as if tucking in a restless child and asked Amara to attend the reading. She agreed before fear could name itself. Somewhere beyond the windows, the lighthouse swept, counting down. The summons went out like tide warnings. Polite, official, impossible to ignore. By late afternoon, the sky had wrung itself dry, leaving streets the color of old coins. Mara arrived first, the kind of early that treats punctuality like armor. Declan followed, smelling of rain and restless plans. Ruth came straight from the floor, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield she hadn't decided to raise. Amara hesitated at the doorway, surprised by how much the room already knew about them. Victor's office felt carved from quiet. Wood, books, the low thrum of a clock that didn't apologize for moving forward. On a sideboard sat a narrow brass cabinet, keyhole bright as an eye. Victor greeted them with the steadiness of someone accustomed to breaking news gently. No one asked where Elias was. The question floated anyway, large as weather. The clock ticked. The door clicked shut. The room prepared to change what it held. Victor poured water into heavy glasses and spoke of practical things. Sign-in sheets, identification, the order of remarks, as if etiquette might keep sharper edges from drawing blood. Mara thanked him in a voice she used on closings, promising efficiency. Declan asked how long this would take. then apologized without meaning it. Ruth stood a half step back, measuring the air for rules it might contain. Amara's eyes moved to the brass cabinet. The key from last night's envelope had looked older than the room, older than argument. She imagined teeth filing against secrets until they fit. On the desk, a single chair remained empty, set slightly askew, as if someone had just taken a breath and stepped away. The sight tugged at the quiet place in her that kept vigil. She rested a hand in her coat pocket where a folded note waited. She didn't open it. She was already where the words would send her. When the clock struck the hour, Victor closed the door with a finality that felt almost kind. He explained that what they were about to hear was not a standard will, but a set of instructions that required witnesses and conscience. He asked if anyone objected to proceeding. No one spoke. He unfolded a letter with practiced care, and the room rearranged around the sound of paper living into its purpose. The words began with gratitude, for help received, for patience extended to a man learning how to say things before time ran out. Then they shifted. There was mention of a trust, of endowments, of a condition that would be described when everyone named had arrived. Names followed, and with them, the architecture of a map that pulled strangers closer than kin. Amara's chest tightened at the cadence of the sentences. They moved like light across water. Declan exhaled, impatient hope threading through his doubt. Mara's pen still. The letter paused, waiting for a door that hadn't yet opened. Tension arrived on quiet feet. Declan asked about debts, about whether the trust contemplated real life and not just sentiment. He masked the plea as a joke, but the joke's bones showed. Mara wanted clarity, a spreadsheet of love and obligation. She talked of appointments and distance, then stopped when distance looked back at her. Ruth reminded them, gently, firmly, that the man at the center of this was more than math. Amara said nothing. She was watching the empty chair, certain she could hear the soft scrape of a compass lid closing somewhere far away. Victor allowed the questions to run until they tired themselves out. Then he lifted the letter again and read a single line that leveled the ground beneath them. "Those who left me will learn how to stay." The clock marked the sentence as if it were a tied boundary. They all faced the cabinet together, as if hearing it click. Victor reached into his pocket and placed the old key on the table. Metal touched wood with a sound that made everyone still. He said the cabinet held instructions for what came next, and that unlocking it would start a clock measured not in hours, but in choices. Mara's face shifted, something tender surfacing beneath calculation. Declan swallowed, the fight leaving his shoulders. Ruth nodded once, the kind of assent that chooses responsibility before comfort. Amara thought of the note in her pocket, and of the way Elias listened when rooms forgot how. Victor rose, carried the key to the cabinet, and glanced at each of them in turn. The lock accepted the metal like an answer being allowed in. Hinges gave a soft, old breath. Inside lay a leather binder and a small wooden box tied with sailor's knots. The clock in the corner ticked, then seemed to wait for them. The gathering had become a circle. Victor lifted the leather binder and the room steadied, as if the furniture had been warned. He read the preamble first. Dates, signatures, a lattice of entities that always looked like fog until somebody named the harbor. Then he said the part no one expected to hear in that narrow office. Seabright Care, through a holding trust, was owned by the man whose children had just left him under its roof. The words hung like a bell after the strike. Ruth's mouth opened and then found discipline. Declan's posture cracked. The math in his head went quiet. Mara's breathing changed, almost imperceptibly, the kind of shift that doesn't ask permission. Victor kept going. The endowment existed already, audited, earmarked. Wages, upgrades, maintenance, dignity by the line item. There was also a condition, he said. One that couldn't be negotiated or delegated. He paused the letter, letting quiet decide if it would hold them. Outside, a siren thinned and vanished. The brass cabinet gleamed. The key on the table waited. Victor untied the sailor's knots on the wooden box, and the office filled with a tenderness older than any document. Inside lay a brass plaque from an old catwalk, a master key on a faded ribbon, and 5 envelopes sealed in neat strokes. He handed them out in silence. Mara, Declan, Ruth, Amara, Jorge, names that turned the proceeding into a circle. Mara's envelope held a single sheet with a sentence that read like an instruction and a blessing. Declan's held 3 lines and a ledger copy. Ruth's contained authority she had never asked for but had earned. Amara's letter was folded smaller than the rest, as if meant for a pocket near a heart. In the bottom of the box, beneath Felt, lay one more note in the same hand. Open the binder to section 9 when all are present. Victor turned to the page, and the air thinned. The condition wasn't a puzzle. It was a practice. Section 9 read, like a lighthouse log, clipped, precise, concerned only with what kept people from breaking on rocks. The trust endowed Seabright in perpetuity with safeguards that could not be raided by grief or greed. Then came the condition. The personal estate, everything not already pledged to the home, would pass only if the heirs by blood learned how to stay. 30 days of service within Seabright, Victor read. Not supervisory, not symbolic. Present hands. Present hours. Each week included a circle where truth was spoken and recorded, one apology offered without defense, one task chosen by staff and completed without credit. Ruth and Victor would witness. Amara would coordinate. Failient, the remainder poured into the Seabright Foundation. No residue, no second vote. Mara rubbed the edge of her envelope the way a person tests a scar. Declan nodded once, the smallest surrender. Outside, the lighthouse of the framed photograph seemed to lean closer. Inside, the room learned a new tide. They opened their envelopes. Mara's task was inked in a hand that knew her cadence. Clear the storage room at the old lighthouse and read aloud the letters inside to anyone who'd listen, beginning with the nurse who first said his name like a home. Declan's page listed 3 debts to settle, vendors who had carried Seabright through thin months, and a charge to collect 5 life stories from residents and bind them into a book for the die-room shelf. Ruth's letter appointed her steward of the endowment's dignity clauses, empowered to say no when no meant care. Amara's contained a scholarship for further study, and a line that made her sit very still. Direct the Compassion Fund. Find the leaks. For Jorge, a lifetime loan of the piano and a standing Thursday night. They read, and the room softened around them, not with ease, but with a labor worth doing. The map had turned into work boots. Victor closed the binder on a final clause, the kind that redraws horizons. If the condition wasn't met, every remainder, properties, accounts, even the ring, unless specifically bequeathed, flowed into the Seabright Foundation. No partial credit, no appeal. He set down a photocopy of a deed recorded 12 years ago, clean and undeniable. The home had been his the whole time. The shock was quieter now, less a thunderclap than a tide rising around their shoes. Mara exhaled a breath that sounded like letting go of a script. Declan touched the rim of his water glass as if measuring its weight. Ruth's stance gentled. Amara pictured the compass in his palm and understood the mercy of a steady north. Victor asked if anyone would object to beginning the first hour tonight, stocking the dayroom library, calling the vendor on the oldest invoice, writing the schedule for Thursday's music. No one moved to leave. No. Somewhere, a foghorn gave a low, patient note. The key on the ribbon lay waiting. Morning came in clean, as if the night had rinsed the edges of their intentions. Mara found the lighthouse storage room with a key that stuck before it yielded, a small resistance that mirrored her own. Dust lifted in ribbons when she opened the door, and the first box of letters breathed like something living. Amara stood beside her, not directing, only there, which turned the silence into courage. They read aloud to a half-dozen residents who had followed the rumor of voices, notes from keepers to wives, from daughters to fathers at sea. from young men certain their hands could outlast weather. Mara stumbled on a line about missing birthdays and steadied herself by looking up, not down. She wasn't performing. She was returning. When the hour ended, a woman in a wheelchair asked for one more. Mara's throat worked. She said yes. On the way back, she didn't count steps. She carried the letters like light. Declan started his hours with a list and a knot in his stomach. He dialed the oldest invoice first, bracing for anger, and met instead a baker who laughed and said the home had kept her afloat when her ovens were failing. He read the clause about full repayment and heard the woman cry in relief like steam escaping. He crossed it off, hands shaking more than he wanted to admit. After lunch, he carried a recorder and a notebook into the day room and asked 5 residents for their stories. They answered with departures and surprises, weddings in borrowed suits, dogs that found their people twice, a night a radio saved a lonely man. He wrote until his hand cramped, then learned to listen without writing. When Jorge began to riff on a melody that felt like walking home, Declan asked if he could place the tune as chapter titles. Jorge said titles were earned by turning up. Declan turned up. The first truth circle met in the chapel that smelled like lemon oil and raincoats. Ruth opened with ground rules that sounded like mercy with a spine. Victor sat near the aisle, pen closed, not taking notes because some things shouldn't be captured that way. Amara lit a battery candle and set it in the middle. Mara spoke first, carefully at the edges, then truer, admitting that if efficiency had been her armor, and that sometimes armor grows heavier than what it guards. Declan confessed to counting miles and dollars until people blurred, to wanting to be better and not knowing the door. Jorge told a joke that broke the tension, and in the echo, Elias cleared his throat. He thanked them for showing up, called showing up a way of staying, and apologized for the times he mistook silence for strength. The room exhaled as if released from a held plank. Outside, rain flirted with the windows and then changed its mind. Just after dusk, the wind found its teeth. A transformer hiccuped somewhere beyond the parking lot, and the lights lapsed into a flicker that made fear consider itself. Ruth moved like a metronome, assigning flashlights, checking oxygen, shepherding the anxious to the sunroom, where windows made the dark honest. Amara took vitals with the efficiency of a pianist running scales. Jorge's breath tightened, old rust in the lungs, and Declan steadied the pulse oximeter with fingers that remembered shaking earlier in the day. Mara read another letter aloud, voice becoming the lamp the room needed. In the half-light, Elias pressed the brass compass into Declan's palm with a nod that said direction is borrowed sometimes. The generators hummed awake. Someone clapped once, then more followed. The sound small and brave. Power returned in a soft bloom. The room didn't cheer loud. It settled, practiced. They had not passed a test. They had kept each other. Thursday arrived with floors that shone and a piano that remembered every fingertip it had ever met. The schedule Declan drafted hung beside the dining room clock. And Mara's sign up for letters at 2, filled in with handwriting from people who hadn't signed anything fun in years. Amara opened a small drawer, labeled Compassion Fund, and quietly settled 2 rides for families without gas money. Ruth posted the dignity clauses on the board and watched the room read them, the way sailors read skies. When evening gathered, Jorge took his place at the piano and let the first chord rise like heat. Elias sat close, his hands idle for once. Victor stood at the doorway, easier in his suit. They were not forgiven of everything. They were something better, engaged, busy with repair. When the chorus found them, voices uneven and earnest, Mars Alta held a line while Declan turned the compass in his pocket and faced the same shore as everyone else. 30 days sounds like a sentence until you live each one as a promise. The last morning began with the hush of polished floors and the smell of oranges from the cleaner Jorge insisted on because it tastes like sunlight in the air. Ruth checked the final log with the focus of a captain clearing a channel. Victor stood by, ready to witness, his pen uncapped but still. Declan placed the bound book of 5 stories on the dining-room shelf and didn't straighten it again. Mara carried the last bundle of lighthouse letters like bread, warm from an oven, surprised by the ache of setting them down. Amara unlocked the drawer of the Compassion Fund and counted what remained, enough to say yes twice more this week. When they gathered in the chapel, Elias listened with his eyes as much as his ears. They spoke not of tasks completed, but of rooms changed. The candle didn't flicker. It steadied. The lighthouse room breathed like a place rediscovered. Mara read the last letter to a small circle. Amara at her side, Jorge tapping a quiet rhythm on his knee, Declan in the doorway, pretending not to watch his sister. The letter was from a keeper to a daughter he'd missed too many weekends, his apology stubborn and plain. Halfway through, the paper blurred. Mara blinked hard and kept going, her voice finding a tone without armor. When she finished, she folded the sheet and pressed it to her heart before returning it to its box. Elias, who had listened from the threshold, slipped off his ring and rolled it between his fingers as if testing weight against meaning. He asked Mara to hold out her hand. He didn't make a speech. He said the ring had one job left: to remind the person wearing it that love is maintenance, not marble. Mara nodded, and the old gold found a new home. By afternoon, the law office felt less like a threshold and more like a ledger closed with care. Victor read the certification of service aloud, Ruth attesting with a simple yes, and the document settled into the file as if it had been waiting for the right weight of truth. The personal estate would pass as written, modest compared to the endowment, yet not small, divided between Mara and Declan, with specific bequests. The ring already given, the brass compass formally to Declan, the scholarship endowed in Amara's name, the piano entrusted to Jorge for life with maintenance guaranteed, and stewardship clauses granting Ruth a permanent veto where dignity wavered. There was one more line: a right of first refusal for the residents' council on any future decision affecting their daily lives. Declan exhaled, surprised by the relief of obligations that pointed outward. Mara asked to add her commissions to the Compassion Fund for a quarter. No one clapped. The room understood promises better than applause. Evening arrived with a crowd that looked like an answer. The dining room filled not because of a flyer, but because people had gotten used to turning toward sound. Declan placed the finished book, 5 rooms, 5 roads, on a stand and read a paragraph that wasn't his best line but was the truest. Mara posted her first monthly schedule with her own name in the shifts, a square of time that could not be negotiated away. Amara, now director, Compassion Fund, wrote 2 fuel vouchers and a hotel night for a daughter who needed a place between storms. Ruth stood near the bulletin board and didn't hover. Her rules had learned to breathe. Jorge touched the piano and the room leaned in as if the first chord were a door. When it came, it was warm and imperfect, and that made it communal. Elias watched with the indulgent pride of a keeper, letting a new crew set the lamp. Night pressed its ear to the windows and listened. Elias stood, slow but steady, and asked for a minute that wasn't on the schedule. He thanked the staff for patience and the residents for the grace of neighbors. He thanked his children for staying until the work felt like habit. He did not apologize for the test because he had taken it too. Then he asked for the lights to dim and for the blinds to rise. The lighthouse beam crossed the dark like a metronome for the tide between them. He touched 2 fingers to his brow in a salute to a life that had kept him, and then placed his hand on Declan's shoulder, on Mara's hand, on Amara's hand, on Amara's forearm, and finally on Ruth's clipboard, as if blessing the tools of this small world. The room answered with quiet that felt like yes. Outside, the beam swept again. Inside, someone began a harmony. The second chance was not an event. It was a practice they had chosen.